Now, our time this morning is limited a little bit, so we're going to just jump straight into the passage. And as I mentioned before, please keep the Bible passage open in front of you, because I'm going to be referring to some verses which won't be on the screen, and I'm going to be depending on you to just glance down and look at them in the Bible in front of you. As chapter 13 begins, we see that prosperity can bring disagreements, even amongst God's people. That's our first heading this morning, and here we're looking at verses 1 to 7 of chapter 13, that prosperity can bring disagreements even among God's people. You see, God's people can experience success. God's people can experience a measure of wealth. That is possible. And it's what we see in Abram's life. That's spelled out for us in verses 1 to 5 especially. Here Abram's return to the place where he had dwelt before, that was before going to Egypt, his return there, and his return to where he had built an altar. Both of these facts are stressed here in these opening verses of Genesis chapter 13. Abram had gone up. He'd gone up from Egypt to the Negev, and verse 3 says he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. Verse 4, to the place where he had built an altar at first, and there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. You see, this is both a return to the land that God had promised, and it is a return to worship. And no doubt starting with a sacrifice on the altar, a sacrifice asking for God's forgiveness, Abram showing his repentance for all that had taken place during the time that he was in Egypt. So in a very real sense, Abram is putting the disastrous experiences of Egypt behind him and making a new start. So a new start for Abram. And for us today, for us as well, a new start is possible. It's possible by trusting in a sacrifice. For us, we're trusting in a sacrifice too. And it was a sacrifice made for us by Abram's greatest son, the Lord Jesus. A sacrifice not made on an altar, a pile of rocks, but no, a sacrifice made on a cross. And we're going to be thinking about that especially during this incoming week. Now for Abram, it's a new start. It's a new start, but which includes the wealth that he had acquired in Egypt. Verse 2 tells us Abram had become very wealthy. You'll see that there in front of you in verse 2. And the episode in Egypt had contributed greatly to that wealth. We heard last week how he was given animals, camels, donkeys, sheep, all sorts of animals, and even servants. And his nephew Lot, who was with Abram, he also had animals. He had flocks and herds and tents. You'll see that there in verse 5. Now, the very first sign that there's a problem, first sign there's any problem, is there in verses 6 and 7. Those verses will be on the screen, I think. Verses 6 and 7. Now, it seems that having great wealth brings with it other needs. Now, for Abram and for Lot, it brought with it specifically the need for sufficient land to support all of those animals. And it's the lack of such land which leads to friction between their herdsmen. Now, twice in verse 6, we're told that the land could not support both Adam and Lot if they remained together. Twice in the one verse. There just wouldn't be enough water. There just wouldn't be enough pasture land, enough food for all of their animals if they stayed together. And that should probably provoke in us a question. We should be asking ourselves, but how could that be? After all, this was the land, the promised land, the land which the Lord had said would one day be the home of a vast nation, a vast vast number of people all descended from Abram. So how would the land support them if this is the experience that Abram and Lot face in today's passage? Well, it's because, as the end of verse 7 reminds us, the land was already inhabited by the Canaanites and the Perizzites, who no doubt they occupied the best parts of the land, leaving only the least fertile areas available to Abram and to Lot. And not only that, this mention of these existing inhabitants, this mention actually hints at the danger which Abram and Lot were in, because we know that the Canaanites and the Perizzites, they were warrior tribes. And so because of their large wealth, Abram and Lot were facing a very serious problem, which was already causing arguments and disagreements amongst their herdsmen. The next section then teaches us that the disagreements can often be settled by generous actions of those living by faith. I'll say that again. Disagreements can often be settled by the generous actions of those living by faith. And that's our second heading. And here we're looking at verses 8 to 13, where we see that those who walk by faith really can and really should be generous and considerate people. In verses 8 and 9, Abram's solution to the dispute between the herdsmen was to allow his nephew Lot to choose a portion of the land for himself. And he allowed him to go first. So Abram could have clung to the land as his rightful possession. This, after all, was the land promised to him by God. But no, he offered Lot a portion of it, and he gave him the first choice of where that portion of land would be. As the leader of the clan, Abram had the primary responsibility of ensuring peace. And he did that using the land. And his motivation, verse 8 tells us, was so that there would be no strife between him and his nephew Lot. Now just imagine the Israelite people hearing these words from Moses all those centuries later. We know that those first 5 books of the Bible were given to us. We have them in our Bibles because they were written by Moses, inspired by God. But imagine those Israelite people hearing them for the first time. They would feel the rebuke of these words, because they knew that they had caused strife. Many times, on numerous occasions, they had caused strife, especially in the wilderness near a place called Meribah, where they had no water. In fact, the place was called Meribah, which means striving or quarreling. It was called Meribah because of the people's complaining. They were actually complaining, the complaining which arose because the people lacked water. But probably more importantly than that, they actually lacked the belief that the God who had rescued them out of Egypt was able to provide for them. So those first readers would have heard the rebuke of these words, because they knew that they had caused strife. They had been the cause of much complaining and disagreement. But let's get back to Abram and Lot. The solution to the striving, the solution to the quarreling which threatened their relationship, the solution was to separate. And so Abram, the rightful owner of all the land promised to him by God, Abram offers Lot whatever he chooses, whilst he, Abram, would take what remained. So we've seen that those who walk by faith really can and should be generous and considerate people. And that includes us today, if we are people who walk by faith, who live in the grace of God. Next then, in verses 10 through to 13, we see that those who walk by sight are easily deceived. Here we're thinking about Lot choosing the best of the land for himself, Whenever Lot lifted his eyes and saw the well-watered, fertile land of the Jordan Valley, he chose that portion. Verse 10 says it was like Egypt. In fact, it was like the garden, referring to the Garden of Eden. What Lot saw with his eyes stirred up his desires, just like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil had done whenever Eve had looked at it in the Garden of Eden. There's very definite parallels here. You see, Lot was attracted to the land in the Jordan Valley, just as Eve had been to that forbidden fruit. Lot was attracted to the land in the Jordan Valley, and all the other factors were quickly forgotten, such as the land's nearness to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and or Gomorrah, they get an ominous mention in 3 of the next 4 verses. That's from verses 10 to 13. Especially in verse 13, which says that the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now, this description seems to indicate that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 cities, they were actually a step below ordinary sinners, normal sinners, if that was possible. And that the Lord was fully aware of and deeply offended by their great sinfulness. Alan Ross is a guy that you've heard me mention before. It's his commentary, along with some others, that I found very, very helpful. And Alan Ross, in his commentary, points out that few passages in Genesis describe the wickedness of a people so strongly. These people were wicked. Alan Ross also points out the similarities here in this episode with the description of the world's people before the flood, and how that corruption back then, how that corruption was catastrophically wiped out by God. The parallels are there. So the implication is, in other words, watch out, Sodom and Gomorrah. And it seems that we can be almost certain that the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah, it was so great that it was widely known by everyone at that time in Abram's day. But despite all of that, it didn't seem to trouble Lot. He doesn't seem to give that any consideration when he chooses the land that he picks. And neither does he show any concern for his uncle Abram. He didn't show any concern for his needs. Verse 11 and 12. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The 2 men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. Lot's choice would prove to be the biggest mistake of his life. And in a few weeks' time, we're going to be reading and hearing and thinking a little bit more about that. But for us today, we need to learn from Lot's mistake. We need to learn that often our own eyes and our own desires are not to be trusted. But instead, we must be on our guard so that they don't lead us into sin, so that they don't lead us into trouble. So don't follow the example of Lot, who walked by sight. Now, in the remaining verses of today's reading, verses 14 through to 18, we see that the generosity of those whose faith is in God will receive his approval. In verses 14 to 17, we see that God's promise remains for those whose trust is in him. That promise remains. So after Lot has left, God's promises to Abram are again confirmed. In fact, it's a sense in which they're reaffirmed to him in these closing verses of chapter 13. There is a clear break here from the previous verses. This together with the return to the land and the return to worship, which we saw earlier. This really is a new beginning for Abram. These closing verses of Genesis 13, they explain how it was possible that Abram could offer the land to Lot, how he could do that in the first place. These verses here make sense of Abram's earlier actions. It turns out that he could do what he did because he trusted in God's promises to him. And so, when we find those promises included here again, it reinforces the earlier lesson. That earlier lesson that those who trust in the Lord really can and really should be generous and considerate toward others. By faith, Abram knew that his descendants would possess the land. And because he knew that because he trusted in God's promises to give it to them. All of it. North, east, south, west, says God in verse 14. And in verse 15, God continues, he says, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. And then in verse 17, Abram is commanded to journey about throughout the land, throughout the length and breadth of the land. And the Lord promises to give all of it to Abram's people. And so Abram's generosity to Lot, when you think of it, it was no big deal. Even if Lot chose the best part, there would be plenty to go around. So Abram's actions were motivated by his trust in the promises of God. Just spot the contrast though between Abram and Lot, because that contrast is quite remarkable. The two men couldn't be more different. For example, in verse 14, God tells Abram to lift up his eyes, whereas earlier we read how Lot had lifted up his own eyes. Now we could list other differences too, but the point is that Lot grabs what Abram generously gives to him, whereas Abram humbly waits upon the Lord. Now, linked to the promise of land is the promise of vast numbers of descendants. Vast numbers of descendants who would ultimately be the ones to possess the land. Look at verse 16. God says, I will make your offspring, he says this to Abram, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. In other words, the vastness of the land that the Lord was promising Abram would be matched by the vast number of Abram's descendants. It's not surprising then that Abram's response is to worship the Lord. Look at verse 18. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So chapter 13 finishes, it ends where it began, with Abram building an altar to worship the Lord. Now throughout this whole episode, Abram is seen, he's a man whose devotion to the Lord is seen consistently. It was this devoted faith in the Lord which enabled Abram to respond so generously when the quarreling began. And it's his faith in the Lord that enabled him to wait patiently for the Lord to fulfill his promises. Yes, this is the same guy who last week thought it was a good idea to deceive people into thinking that his wife was in fact his sister. It's the same guy. What made the difference? Well, it seems that Abram was learning to trust God in every circumstance, and that God was doing a work in Abram's life, changing him, which surely and hopefully is an encouragement to each and every one of us, because the same Lord can change you and me. He can change us as we learn to trust him in every circumstance. Just like we see Abram learning in a passage like this one today. So with that in mind, let's take a moment just now to pray.